The sliding doors of the emergency room parted with a hiss, and Simone Evans stepped inside, her face a canvas of pain and determination. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes, highlighting the toll of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. As she approached the reception area, a familiar sense of dread settled in her stomach. Simone had been here before, each visit blurring into the next, a carousel of dismissals and disappointments. She hesitated, her hand gripping the strap of her purse tightly. The symptoms that brought her here today were worse than ever. A searing pain that radiated through her abdomen, accompanied by waves of nausea that left her dizzy and weak. This time, the intensity of her discomfort was impossible to ignore, forcing her to seek help once more despite her reservations. As she stood there, wavering, memories of her previous visits surfaced. The long waits, the dismissive attitudes, the feeling of being invisible. All of it weighed heavily on her mind. Simone couldn't shake the nagging thought that her concerns had been consistently brushed aside, leaving her to suffer in silence. Simone took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Would this visit be any different? The weight of past disappointments pressed down on her, but the escalating nature of her symptoms left her no choice. She had to try again, had to make them see, had to make them listen. With trembling fingers, Simone signed her name on the check-in sheet. The receptionist glanced up, a flicker of recognition crossing her face, before she schooled her features into neutrality.
Take a seat, Mrs. Evans. Someone will be with you shortly.
Simone nodded and turned towards the waiting area, her steps slow and measured. As she lowered herself into an uncomfortable plastic chair, she caught sight of a figure in scrubs striding purposefully across the room. Nurse Wallace. The very sight of her made Simone's heart rate spike. Little did Nurse Wallace know, her next decision would spark a chain reaction that would shake the very foundations of the hospital. As she approached Simone, the air crackled with unspoken tension. What hidden biases lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly routine encounter? Nurse Wallace's eyes flicked up from her computer screen, a flicker of recognition crossing her face as she spotted Simone in the waiting area. Her lips tightened into a thin line, a barely concealed sigh escaping as she stood up from her desk. Wallace's demeanor spoke volumes, her rigid posture and the slight furrow in her brow betraying a mixture of frustration and skepticism before Simone had even uttered a word. This wasn't their first encounter. Over the past few months, Nurse Wallace had been a constant presence during Simone's repeated visits to the ER. Each interaction seemed to reinforce Wallace's preconceptions, her initial skepticism hardening into a dismissive attitude that Simone could feel radiating off her in waves. As Wallace approached, her body language screamed disbelief. She stood with her weight shifted to one hip, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield.
Back again, Mrs. Evans?
She asked, her tone a mixture of weariness and poorly concealed judgment.
What seems to be the problem this time?
Simone took a deep breath, steeling herself for the interaction ahead. She could feel the weight of every dismissal, every raised eyebrow, every barely concealed sigh of impatience from her previous visits pressing down on her. How would this encounter unfold? Would she finally be heard? Or would her pain once again be minimized and brushed aside?
The pain is worse,
Simone began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands.
It's in my abdomen and spreading to my back. I'm feeling dizzy and nauseous.
She watched Nurse Wallace's face carefully, searching for any sign of genuine concern or understanding. Wallace's pen hovered over her clipboard, her expression inscrutable. For a moment, it seemed as though she might actually listen, but then her professional mask slipped back into place, and she began jotting down notes with quick, efficient strokes.
I see.
She said, her tone non-committal.
And how long has this been going on?
As Simone recounted her symptoms, she couldn't shake the feeling that her words were falling on deaf ears. Wallace nodded at appropriate intervals, but her eyes held a distant look, as if she'd already made up her mind about the validity of Simone's complaints. Finally, Wallace lowered her clipboard.
All right, Mrs. Evans, we'll get you checked out, but it sounds like it could be related to stress or perhaps some dietary issues. Try to relax and we'll call you when a doctor is available.
With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to her station, leaving Simone feeling once again unheard and invalidated. Simone's eyes followed Nurse Wallace's retreating form, her own body a battlefield of unseen torment. In the bustling emergency room, a cruel irony unfolded. Those tasked with healing were blind to her suffering. How could such a disconnect exist in modern medicine? As Simone settled back into her uncomfortable plastic chair, a wave of pain crashed over her, causing her to double over. She clutched her side, her face contorting in agony that seemed invisible to those around her. The sharp stabbing sensation in her abdomen had intensified, radiating outward like tendrils of fire. Nausea roiled in her stomach, threatening to overwhelm her at any moment. Other patients in the waiting room cast sideways glances at Simone. Some faces showed sympathy, recognizing the signs of genuine distress. Others, however, held skepticism in their eyes, as if questioning the validity of her pain. Simone felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone in her suffering. The concept of health literacy, which had plagued Simone's previous visits, continued to play a crucial role. Her repeated dismissals had eroded her confidence in expressing her symptoms effectively. She found herself second-guessing her own body's signals, wondering if she was indeed overreacting, as Nurse Wallace seemed to imply. This self-doubt only widened the communication gap between patient and provider, making it even harder for her to convey the severity of her condition. As the minutes ticked by, stretching into hours, Simone's discomfort grew increasingly unbearable. She shifted in her seat, trying to find a position that offered even a modicum of relief. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow harsher, the murmur of voices around her more grating. Would anyone recognize the severity of her condition before it was too late? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a nurse called out,
"Simone Evans?"
Simone struggled to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. As she followed the nurse towards an examination room, memories of her previous visits flashed through her mind. Each one had ended in disappointment and dismissal, leaving her feeling more desperate and alone than before. As Simone entered the examination room, a familiar sense of dread washed over her. How many times had she been here before, pleading for someone to take her pain seriously? The answer would shock even the most seasoned medical professionals. Simone eased herself onto the cold examination table, wincing as another wave of pain rippled through her abdomen. The sterile white walls and antiseptic smell transported her back to her first visit, just 3 months ago. She had come in with mild discomfort, hoping for answers. Instead, she left with a handful of pamphlets on stress management and a growing seed of doubt in her mind. Simone's mind reeled as she recalled the dismissive attitudes, the raised eyebrows, the barely concealed sighs of impatience. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she looked different, if her skin were a few shades lighter, her complaints might be taken more seriously. The concept of medical gaslighting loomed large in her thoughts, a term she had discovered during her desperate late-night research sessions. As Simone sat there, her body a canvas of unacknowledged pain, she couldn't help but wonder how many other women like her had suffered in silence. How many had given up, convinced that their pain was all in their heads. The thought made her heart ache almost as much as her physical symptoms. Simone's fingers traced the edge of the examination table, her mind racing. She reflected on how these experiences had eroded her trust in the medical system. Once, she believed that doctors and nurses were infallible, armed with the knowledge and compassion to heal any ailment. Now, that faith lay in tatters, replaced by a wary skepticism that made her chest tighten with each hospital visit. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. Simone knew she needed to advocate for herself, to make them listen this time. But as she heard footsteps approaching the door, she realized she'd been holding her breath, bracing herself for the inevitable dismissal that seemed to follow her like a shadow in these sterile halls. The footsteps grew louder, each click of heels on linoleum, a countdown to what Simone feared would be another disappointment. But in the next few minutes, a shocking turn of events would expose a deep-rooted problem in the hospital, one that went far beyond a single patient or nurse. The door swung open, and Nurse Wallace entered, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Her expression was a mixture of fatigue and thinly veiled skepticism. The atmosphere in the small examination room instantly became charged with unspoken tension.
So, Mrs. Evans,
Nurse Wallace began, her tone clipped and professional.
what seems to be the problem today?
The question hung in the air, loaded with implications of doubt before Simone had even opened her mouth to speak. Simone took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had rehearsed her symptoms in her mind countless times, determined to make herself heard. But as she began to speak, she found herself stumbling over her words, the intensity of her pain making it difficult to articulate clearly.
The pain is worse.
She managed, her voice barely above a whisper.
It's not just in my stomach anymore. It's spreading to my back, and I feel dizzy and nauseous.
Simone watched Nurse Wallace's face carefully, searching for any sign of concern or understanding. The power dynamics at play in this moment were palpable. Nurse Wallace stood tall, her position of authority evident in her stance and demeanor. Simone, in contrast, sat hunched on the examination table, her body language betraying her discomfort and vulnerability. This imbalance of power is a common issue in patient-provider interactions, often leading to communication breakdowns and misunderstandings. Nurse Wallace jotted down notes on her clipboard, her pen moving swiftly across the page.
And how long have you been experiencing these symptoms?
She asked, her tone neutral but tinged with a hint of impatience. Simone's heart sank as she recognized the familiar pattern unfolding. She could feel her chance at being taken seriously, slipping away with each passing second. The stress of the situation was exacerbating her symptoms, making it even harder to communicate effectively. Research has shown that stress can significantly impact how patients present their symptoms and communicate with healthcare providers, often leading to misinterpretations and missed diagnoses. As Nurse Wallace continued her assessment, asking routine questions with an air of detachment, Simone couldn't shake the feeling that her words were falling on deaf ears. She tried to emphasize the severity of her pain, the way it had intensified over the past few days, but her pleas seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of skepticism. Finally, Nurse Wallace lowered her clipboard and fixed Simone with a look that was equal parts weariness and dismissal.
Mrs. Evans,
She began, her tone measured.
based on your symptoms, it seems that this is likely related to stress. Have you been under any additional pressure lately? Work? Family issues?
Simone felt a wave of defeat wash over her. Once again, her pain was being attributed to stress, her physical symptoms dismissed as mere manifestations of anxiety. She opened her mouth to protest, to insist that this was different, that something was seriously wrong, but the words died in her throat. Nurse Wallace, seemingly satisfied with her assessment, began wrapping up the visit.
I'd recommend trying some relaxation techniques, maybe some over-the-counter pain relievers. If the symptoms persist, you can always come back, but for now, try to get some rest and reduce your stress levels.
As Nurse Wallace turned to leave, Simone felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Little did either of them know, the next 60 seconds would shatter the routine of the ER and expose a systemic failure that had been hiding in plain sight. How often does a moment of crisis become the catalyst for long overdue change? The thud of Simone's body hitting the floor jolted Nurse Wallace into action. She rushed forward, her clipboard clattering to the ground as she knelt beside the unconscious woman.
Code Blue!
She shouted, her voice cracking with a mixture of urgency and dawning realization.
I need help in here, now!
As the alarm blared through the ER, staff members rushed towards the examination room. The once quiet hallway erupted into a flurry of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Simone's prone form, their voices a cacophony of medical jargon and urgent commands. In the chaos, Nurse Wallace found herself pushed to the periphery. She watched, her heart pounding, as her colleagues worked to stabilize Simone. The gravity of the situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. How had she missed the signs? How had her preconceptions clouded her judgment so severely? Statistics flashed through her mind, unbidden and damning. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. They are 49% more likely to deliver prematurely. These disparities persist even when accounting for factors like education and income level. Guilt and shame washed over Nurse Wallace as she realized the role her own biases may have played in this critical delay. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she had listened more carefully, if she had looked beyond her initial assumptions, they might not be in this dire situation now. As the medical team worked frantically to revive Simone, the ER doors slid open once more. A tall, distinguished man in a white coat strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Little did anyone know, this unexpected arrival was about to turn the entire situation on its head. Dr. Charles Evans strode through the emergency room, his polished shoes echoing against the linoleum floor. As chief of medicine, his presence always commanded attention, but today, something felt different. The air crackled with an unusual energy, and the staff's demeanor shifted noticeably as he passed. Nurses straightened their postures, doctors lowered their voices, and even the most seasoned professionals seemed to hold their breath. Evans had arrived for what he thought would be a routine department check. He enjoyed these unannounced visits, believing they kept the staff on their toes and maintained the high standards he demanded. Little did he know that today's visit would shatter his perceptions of his own hospital and force him to confront uncomfortable truths about the very system he presided over. As he made his way through the bustling ER, Evans couldn't help but notice the hierarchical dance playing out around him. Junior staff members deferred to their superiors, who in turn looked to him for approval. This rigid structure, while efficient in many ways, often created barriers to open communication and quick decision-making in critical moments. Evans observed the staff's interactions closely, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. He saw how some team members hesitated to speak up, even when they had valuable input. The weight of his presence seemed to intensify these behaviors, and he found himself wondering about the long-term effects on patient care. As Evans rounded a corner, his attention was drawn to a flurry of activity surrounding one of the examination rooms. The usual hum of the ER had been replaced by urgent voices and the clatter of medical equipment. His brow furrowed as he approached, curiosity and concern warring within him.
"What's the situation here?"
he asked, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. The staff parted like a sea, revealing a scene that made Evans' blood run cold. On the floor lay an unconscious woman, her dark skin ashen, surrounded by a team working frantically to stabilize her. For a moment, Evans' professional demeanor slipped. His eyes widened in recognition, and he felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. How could this be happening? How had he not known? The questions raced through his mind as he struggled to process the sight before him. As the chief of medicine stood frozen, the implications of what he was witnessing began to unfold in his mind. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a failure of the system he had sworn to uphold. A system that, despite his best intentions, had allowed bias and negligence to seep into its very foundation. As the reality of the situation sank in, Dr. Evans felt his world shift on its axis. The unconscious woman on the floor wasn't just another patient. She was the person he loved most in the world. How does a man reconcile his roles as both a medical professional and a desperate husband when the stakes couldn't be higher? Dr. Evans' professional mask cracked, revealing the raw anguish of a man whose worst nightmare had materialized before his eyes. His wife, Simone, lay motionless on the cold hospital floor, surrounded by a team of medical professionals who had no idea of the personal tragedy unfolding in their midst. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the enormity of the situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. The staff continued their frantic efforts to stabilize Simone, unaware of the connection between the patient and their chief of medicine. Voices called out vitals, hands moved with practiced efficiency, and machines beeped with an urgency that matched the pounding of Evans' heart. He watched, frozen in place, as his colleagues worked to save the life of the woman he loved, their actions both familiar and surreal in this new, terrible context. Dr. Evans' mind raced, torn between his instinct to rush to Simone's side and his duty as chief of medicine. His heart ached to hold her hand, to whisper words of comfort in her ear, but his medical training screamed at him to maintain objectivity. He felt as if he were being torn in two, each half of his identity warring against the other. The emotional turmoil threatened to overwhelm him as memories of Simone flashed through his mind. Their first date, their wedding day, the quiet moments of companionship they'd shared over the years. All of it seemed to hang in the balance as he watched her fight for her life. The fear of losing her was a physical pain in his chest, constricting his breath and clouding his thoughts. As the seconds ticked by, Dr. Evans grappled with the impossible choice before him. Should he step back, allowing his team to work without the added pressure of his personal investment? Or should he take charge, using his expertise and intimate knowledge of Simone's medical history to potentially save her life. The weight of this decision pressed down on him, each moment feeling like an eternity. The tension in the room grew palpable as staff members began to notice Dr. Evans' unusual behavior. Whispers rippled through the crowd, eyes darting between the chief of medicine and the patient on the floor. The atmosphere shifted, charged with a new undercurrent of uncertainty and concern. Dr. Evans could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, their questioning glances adding to the pressure he already felt. He knew that his decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Simone's treatment, but for his own career and the dynamics of the entire hospital. The ethical implications of his involvement weighed heavily on his mind, even as his heart screamed at him to do everything in his power to save her. Finally, Dr. Evans made his decision. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity born of desperation and determination.
I need a full account of this patient's treatment immediately.
He commanded, his tone brooking no argument.
This is my wife, and I want to know exactly what happened here.
The room fell silent for a beat, the shock of his words reverberating through the staff. Then, like a dam breaking, the silence gave way to a flurry of renewed activity. Nurses rushed to gather charts, doctors hurried to provide updates, and the entire team refocused their efforts with a new sense of urgency. Amidst the chaos, one figure remained motionless. Nurse Wallace stood frozen, her face a mask of dawning horror. What happens when a healthcare provider is forced to confront their own biases in the most public and consequential way possible? Nurse Wallace felt as if the floor had opened up beneath her feet. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment faded into the background as she struggled to process the gravity of her actions. Her mind raced, replaying each interaction with Simone Evans over the past few months. Every dismissive comment, every skeptical glance, every moment she had attributed Simone's complaints to stress or exaggeration now weighed on her conscience like lead. Dr. Evans turned to face Nurse Wallace, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and anguish.
Explain to me,
he said, his voice low and controlled.
Why my wife's symptoms were repeatedly dismissed. I want to know every detail of her visits, every complaint, and every decision made regarding her care.
Wallace opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt the eyes of her colleagues boring into her, their expressions a mix of shock, disappointment, and barely concealed judgment. The realization that she had failed not just as a healthcare professional, but as a human being, hit her with crushing force.
I didn't realize.
Wallace finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper.
Mrs. Evans' symptoms seemed, I thought.
She trailed off, the inadequacy of her explanations painfully apparent in light of Simone's critical condition. Dr. Evans' expression hardened.
You thought what? That she was exaggerating? That her pain wasn't real?
His voice rose with each question, the facade of professional detachment crumbling under the weight of his personal anguish. Wallace felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The full impact of her actions, that her biases may have contributed to a patient's critical condition, and that patient was the wife of the chief of medicine, overwhelmed her. She couldn't help but wonder how many other patients she might have misjudged, how many others she had failed. As the confrontation unfolded, the implications for the hospital began to crystallize in the minds of everyone present. This wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem. How many other patients had suffered due to similar biases? How deep did this systemic failure run? Wallace took a shaky breath, steeling herself to face the consequences of her actions.
Dr. Evans,
She began, her voice steadier now.
I take full responsibility for my failure to properly assess and treat Mrs. Evans, but I also believe this incident reveals deeper issues within our system. We need to examine our protocols, our training, and our culture to ensure this never happens again.
Dr. Evans' jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and determination. He glanced at his watch, then back at the bustling ER.
Everyone who's not directly involved in patient care conference room now.
He barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. As the staff filed into the cramped conference room, the air crackled with tension. Nurses avoided eye contact. Doctors fidgeted uncomfortably, and even the most seasoned professionals seemed to shrink under Dr. Evans' piercing gaze. They knew this wasn't about one patient or one nurse. This was about a systemic failure that had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. Dr. Evans stood at the head of the table, his normally composed demeanor replaced by barely contained rage.
"What happened today is unacceptable."
He began, his voice low and dangerous.
"But it's not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem."
He pulled up a series of patient case files on the projection screen, each one more damning than the last. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. These weren't just abstract numbers. They represented real people, real suffering, real lives at risk. And today, it had nearly cost Dr. Evans his wife.
"We've prided ourselves on being a top-tier hospital."
Dr. Evans continued, his voice rising with each word.
"But what good is cutting-edge technology if we're failing the most basic test of humanity? How can we call ourselves healers if we're letting our biases dictate who receives care and who doesn't?"
The staff shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others looking shell-shocked. Dr. Evans took a deep breath, steadying himself.
"Starting today, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, from janitors to surgeons. We're creating a patient advocacy program to ensure every voice is heard. And we're launching a full review of our protocols, with a focus on identifying and eliminating disparities in care."
He paused, letting his words sink in. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on each person in the room. Nurse Wallace, her face etched with a mixture of guilt and determination, spoke up.
Dr. Evans, I think I speak for all of us when I say we're ready to do whatever it takes to make this right.
A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Dr. Chen, a veteran surgeon, stood up.
We've been blind to our own biases for too long. It's time we face this head-on, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Dr. Evans nodded, a glimmer of hope breaking through his anger.
"This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about acknowledging our shortcomings and committing to do better. Because every patient who walks through those doors deserves our best, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status."
As the meeting adjourned, the staff filed out with a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to confront their biases and transform their hospital into a true beacon of equitable healthcare. While Dr. Evans ignited a firestorm of reform, his wife lay still, teetering on the edge of consciousness. But as Simone's eyes fluttered open, she entered a world vastly different from the one she'd known. How would she navigate this new reality where her pain was no longer ignored? The harsh fluorescent lights assaulted Simone's senses as she slowly regained consciousness. Her vision swam, struggling to focus on the unfamiliar faces hovering above her. The beeping of machines and the hushed whispers of medical staff created a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm her fragile state. As her mind cleared, Simone became acutely aware of the differences in her surroundings. Gone was the dismissive atmosphere she had grown accustomed to during her previous visits. Instead, she found herself at the center of intense medical attention. Nurses adjusted her IV drip with careful precision, while a doctor studied her chart with furrowed brows. Simone couldn't shake the feeling of disorientation. For months, she had fought to be heard, to have her pain acknowledged. Now, as she lay in a hospital bed with a team of medical professionals attending to her every need, the contrast was jarring. She felt a mix of relief and lingering skepticism, her mind struggling to reconcile this new reality with her past experiences. The psychological impact of finally being believed after prolonged dismissal weighed heavily on Simone. Research has shown that patients who experience medical gaslighting often suffer from anxiety, depression, and a loss of trust in healthcare providers. As Simone processed the attentive care she was now receiving, she grappled with a complex web of emotions: gratitude, anger, and a tentative hope that threatened to crumble at any moment. A gentle hand on her arm drew Simone's attention. She turned to see a kind-faced nurse adjusting her pillows.
Mrs. Evans,
The nurse said softly.
how are you feeling? Is there anything you need?
The simple act of being asked about her comfort brought unexpected tears to Simone's eyes. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. As Simone began to respond, she noticed a flurry of activity at the door of her room. Her husband, Charles entered, his face a mixture of relief and concern. He rushed to her side, taking her hand in his.
Simone,
He whispered, his voice thick with emotion.
I'm so sorry. I had no idea.
Charles proceeded to explain the events that had unfolded while she was unconscious. His discovery of her condition, the confrontation with the staff, and the sweeping changes now being implemented throughout the hospital. As Simone listened, her eyes widened with each revelation. The magnitude of what had transpired began to sink in. The realization that her suffering had sparked a revolution in patient care left Simone reeling. She felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness, relief that she had finally been heard, but sorrow for all those who had suffered similar dismissals. As she processed this information, Simone's perspective began to shift. The anger and frustration that had built up over months of ignored complaints began to transform into something new, a determination to ensure that no other patient would have to endure what she had experienced. Simone's fingers trembled as she reached for her laptop, her heart racing with a mixture of determination and trepidation. She knew that speaking out about her experience would expose her vulnerabilities to the world, but the potential to affect real change outweighed her fears. As she began to type, memories of her dismissed pain and the countless others who might have suffered similar fates fueled her resolve. Simone researched tirelessly, uncovering stories of successful advocacy campaigns that had transformed hospital policies and patient care protocols. One such campaign, led by a group of mothers who had lost children to preventable medical errors, had resulted in the implementation of new safety measures across an entire hospital network. As she delved deeper into the world of patient advocacy, Simone learned about the power of personal narratives in driving systemic change. She discovered how sharing her story could shine a light on the hidden biases that plagued the healthcare system, further solidifying her conviction that her voice could make a difference. As she crafted her message, Simone grappled with the potential backlash. She knew that speaking out against a respected institution could invite criticism and skepticism. What if people didn't believe her? What if her story was dismissed as an isolated incident? The weight of these doubts pressed down on her, threatening to silence her before she had even begun. But then Simone remembered the faces of the other patients she had seen in the waiting room, their pain etched in the lines of their faces, their voices unheard. Her resolve strengthened, and she knew that she had to be their voice. Simone's fingers flew across the keyboard as she poured her heart into her story. She detailed her repeated visits to the ER, the dismissal of her symptoms, and the near-fatal consequences of the systemic bias she had encountered. She also outlined her vision for change: mandatory bias training for all medical staff, increased diversity in healthcare leadership, and the implementation of patient advocacy programs in every hospital. As she neared the end of her piece, Simone paused, her cursor hovering over the
Publish
button. She took a deep breath, knowing that once she shared her story, there would be no going back. The impact of her words could ripple far beyond the walls of her local hospital, potentially sparking a nationwide conversation about racial bias in healthcare. As Simone's words reverberated through the healthcare system, they reached an unexpected listener. In a small office, away from the public eye, Nurse Wallace faced a mirror, both literal and metaphorical. What happens when the accused becomes the catalyst for their own redemption? Nurse Wallace sat rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on the PowerPoint presentation before her. The mandatory bias training session felt like both a punishment and a lifeline. Her colleagues' sideways glances burned into her periphery, a constant reminder of her very public fall from grace. As the presenter discussed implicit biases and microaggressions, Wallace found herself engaging more, asking questions that surprised even herself. She scribbled notes furiously, her pen nearly tearing through the paper as she grappled with concepts that challenged her long-held beliefs. The presenter's words about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to form new pathways even in adulthood offered a glimmer of hope. Wallace latched onto this idea, determined to reshape her thinking. She sought out additional resources, joining online forums for healthcare professionals working to address racial bias in medicine. Late at night, she pored over medical journals, educating herself on the disparities in pain management and diagnosis rates among different racial groups. As she returned to her duties, Wallace felt the weight of her colleagues' skepticism. Whispers followed her through the hospital corridors, and patients eyed her warily. Wallace steeled herself against the urge to retreat. Instead, she forced herself to engage, to listen more carefully to each patient's concerns, and to question her initial assumptions at every turn. She began implementing new practices in her daily work. Wallace started asking patients about their cultural backgrounds and how it might affect their healthcare experiences. She advocated for more diverse representation in medical literature and hospital educational materials. In team meetings, she spoke up about the importance of considering racial disparities in treatment plans. The road to redemption proved to be a bumpy one. For every step forward, there were moments of uncertainty, old habits threatening to reassert themselves. Wallace found herself constantly on guard, hyper-aware of her own thought processes. She started keeping a journal, documenting her interactions with patients and reflecting on her decision-making processes. As weeks turned into months, Wallace began to notice subtle shifts. Her colleagues' wary glances softened, replaced by cautious nods of approval as they witnessed her efforts to improve. Patients who had once regarded her with suspicion began to open up, sensing a genuine change in her approach. Some even sought her out specifically, having heard about her commitment to addressing bias in healthcare. Wallace's efforts extended beyond her immediate workplace. She volunteered to lead workshops on cultural competency for new nursing staff. She reached out to local community organizations, offering to speak about her experiences and the importance of recognizing and addressing bias in healthcare settings. With trembling hands, Wallace penned a letter to Simone Evans. The words didn't come easily, each sentence a struggle against pride and fear. But as she wrote, pouring out her commitment to change and the steps she had taken, Wallace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She knew that forgiveness was not guaranteed, that her actions had caused real harm. But in taking this step, in detailing her journey towards becoming a better healthcare provider, Wallace found a measure of peace. While Wallace grappled with her personal journey of redemption, Simone's ordeal had already outgrown the confines of their hospital. What happens when a single case of medical neglect becomes a catalyst for a healthcare revolution? Simone's story spread like wildfire through social media and news outlets, captivating the nation's attention. Her powerful account of repeated dismissals and near-fatal consequences resonated with countless individuals who had experienced similar treatment. Within days, major news networks picked up the story, featuring interviews with Simone and medical experts who shed light on the pervasive issue of racial bias in healthcare. As Simone's narrative gained traction, hospitals across the country found themselves under intense scrutiny. Medical boards and administrators scrambled to examine their own practices, painfully aware that they could be the next target of public outrage. The pressure to address systemic biases became impossible to ignore, with patients and advocacy groups demanding transparency and concrete action. The ripple effects of Simone's case echoed through medical communities nationwide. In conference rooms and staff lounges, healthcare professionals engaged in heated debates about implicit bias and its impact on patient care. Some defended the status quo, arguing that isolated incidents shouldn't overshadow the dedication of hardworking medical staff. Others, deeply moved by Simone's experience, advocated for sweeping reforms. Individual cases have long been catalysts for systemic change in healthcare. The story of Libby Zion, a young woman who died due to medical errors in 1984, led to nationwide reforms in resident working hours. Similarly, the highly publicized case of Betsy Lehman, who died from a chemotherapy overdose in 1994, sparked major improvements in medication safety protocols. As the conversation around Simone's case intensified, healthcare policy experts weighed in on potential solutions. Dr. Asha Patel, a renowned expert in health equity, appeared on national television to discuss the broader implications.
What happened to Simone Evans is not an isolated incident,
she explained.
It's a symptom of deeply rooted biases that permeate our healthcare system. We need comprehensive reforms, from medical school curricula to hospital policies, to address these disparities.
The media spotlight on Simone's story prompted several major hospitals to take preemptive action. Memorial Healthcare System in Chicago announced a full review of their emergency room protocols, with a focus on identifying and eliminating racial disparities in triage and pain management. On the West Coast, Stanford Medical Center launched a task force dedicated to improving cultural competency among their staff. As the movement gained momentum, patient advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for broader policy changes. They lobbied state legislators to mandate bias training for all licensed healthcare providers and called for increased funding for research into health disparities. In New York, a bill was introduced to require hospitals to publicly report their patient satisfaction scores, broken down by race and ethnicity. Meanwhile, a coalition of medical schools across the country announced plans to revamp their curricula to include more comprehensive training on recognizing and addressing implicit bias in clinical settings. While the nation grappled with healthcare reform, Simone faced a more personal challenge. Her body bore the weight of delayed treatment, but it was her spirit that seemed the most fragile. As she began her long road to recovery, one question lingered. Could Simone learn to trust again in a system that had failed her so profoundly? Simone Evans sat in the waiting room of the hospital's outpatient clinic, her fingers nervously tracing the pattern on her purse. The same antiseptic smell that once filled her with dread now seemed almost comforting in its familiarity. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the new posters promoting patient advocacy and the diverse faces of the staff bustling about. Despite the visible changes, Simone couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that clung to her like a second skin. As a nurse called her name, Simone took a deep breath and stood, wincing slightly at the lingering pain in her abdomen. The physical reminders of her ordeal were fading, but the emotional scars ran deep. She followed the nurse down a brightly lit corridor, her steps hesitant, as if her body was reluctant to place itself back into the care of those who had once dismissed her suffering. The examination room felt different this time. Gone was the cold indifference that had characterized her previous visits. Instead, Dr. Amelia Chen greeted Simone with a warm smile and attentive eyes.
How are you feeling today, Mrs. Evans?
She asked, her tone genuine and concerned. Simone felt a lump form in her throat, caught off guard by the simple act of being heard. As Dr. Chen examined her, Simone's mind wandered to the long-term consequences of her delayed diagnosis. Research had shown that patients who experienced prolonged periods of untreated pain often developed chronic conditions, their bodies forever altered by the experience of sustained suffering. Simone couldn't help but wonder what invisible damage lurked beneath her skin, a silent testament to the bias that had nearly cost her life. Throughout the examination, Dr. Chen explained each step, her words a soothing balm to Simone's frayed nerves. This approach, Simone learned, was part of a new trauma-informed care protocol implemented in the wake of her case. The hospital had recognized that medical trauma could be as devastating as any physical injury, requiring a holistic approach to healing both body and mind. As Dr. Chen reviewed Simone's test results, a flicker of hope sparked in Simone's chest. The numbers were improving, her body slowly but surely recovering from the ordeal. Yet, as she listened to the doctor's optimistic prognosis, Simone felt a disconnect between her physical healing and the emotional chasm that still yawned within her.
Mrs. Evans,
Dr. Chen said gently, sensing Simone's unease.
I want you to know that your experience has changed this hospital. We're committed to doing better, to earning back your trust.
Simone nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. It was a start, she thought, a small step on a much longer journey. As Simone left the examination room, she caught sight of her husband, Charles, waiting in the hallway. His presence, once a source of strength and comfort, now carried a weight of its own. How could she reconcile the man she loved with the system that had failed her? In the wake of Simone's ordeal, she and Charles faced an unexpected challenge, rebuilding trust not just in the healthcare system, but in their own relationship. What secrets had remained unspoken, and how would they bridge the silence? As Simone and Charles left the hospital together, the weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them. The car ride home was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sigh or clearing of a throat. Simone stared out the window, her mind racing with questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly, stealing glances at his wife, searching for the right words to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Once home, they sat at the kitchen table, 2 cups of untouched coffee growing cold before them. Charles finally broke the silence.
Simone, I don't know where to begin. I failed you. As a husband, as a doctor, as the chief of medicine. How could I not have known what you were going through?
Simone's eyes welled with tears.
I tried to tell you, Charles, so many times. But you were always so busy, so preoccupied with the hospital. After a while, I just stopped trying.
The realization hit Charles like a physical blow. He remembered the nights he'd come home late, barely registering Simone's presence as he collapsed into bed. The weekends spent catching up on paperwork while she sat alone in the next room. The countless times she'd tried to talk to him about her health concerns, only to be met with distracted nods and non-committal responses.
I thought I was providing for us, building a better future.
Charles said softly.
But I was blind to what was happening right in front of me. I let my work become a wall between us.
Simone reached across the table, hesitantly taking Charles's hand.
It wasn't just you, Charles. I stopped pushing. I convinced myself that my pain wasn't important enough to bother you with. We both let this happen.
As they talked, layers of misunderstanding and missed opportunities peeled away. Charles learned of the countless nights Simone had spent researching her symptoms, too afraid to voice her fears lest she be dismissed again. Simone discovered the guilt Charles had been carrying, the nagging feeling that he was neglecting something important in his pursuit of professional success. They decided to seek couples counseling, recognizing that the road to rebuilding their relationship would be long and challenging. Dr. Amelia Chen recommended a therapist who specialized in helping couples navigate medical trauma and its impact on relationships. In their first session, the therapist helped them establish new communication patterns. They practiced active listening, learning to truly hear each other without judgment or defensiveness. Charles committed to regular,
device-free
evenings, dedicating undivided attention to Simone and their relationship. Simone, in turn, promised to voice her needs and concerns clearly, without minimizing her own experiences. As weeks passed, small changes began to take root. Charles started coming home earlier, making a point to ask Simone about her day and truly listen to her responses. Simone found herself opening up more, sharing not just the big concerns, but the small joys and frustrations of her daily life. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Simone turned to Charles with tears in her eyes.
I'm scared,
she admitted.
What if I can never fully trust the medical system again? What if I can never fully trust you again?
Charles took her hand, his own eyes glistening.
I can't promise that regaining that trust will be easy or quick,
he said.
But I can promise that I'll be here, every step of the way. We'll face this together, and I'll spend every day working to earn back your trust, both in me and in the system I represent.
As they embraced, both Simone and Charles felt a shift. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, they felt truly connected, truly seen by each other. Their journey of healing extended beyond their marriage. Charles threw himself into reforming the hospital's practices, using his position as chief of medicine to implement sweeping changes. Simone found her voice as a patient advocate, sharing her story to empower others and push for systemic change. Dr. Charles Evans stood before a group of eager medical students, his usually confident demeanor tinged with a hint of vulnerability. The lecture hall fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience.
Today, we're going to discuss a case that changed everything for me, both as a doctor and as a husband.
He began, his eyes scanning the room. The students leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. As Dr. Evans recounted Simone's harrowing journey through the healthcare system, the students' expressions shifted from curiosity to shock, then to determination. He detailed the repeated dismissals, the escalating symptoms, and the near-fatal consequences of unchecked bias. With each revelation, the students grappled with their own preconceptions, many realizing for the first time the insidious nature of implicit bias in medical care. The integration of Simone's case into the medical education curriculum marked a significant shift in how cultural competency was taught. Instead of theoretical discussions on diversity, students now faced real-world scenarios that challenged their assumptions and forced them to examine their own potential biases. Dr. Evans' personal connection to the case added a layer of urgency that textbooks simply couldn't convey. As the lecture progressed, Dr. Evans introduced the students to cutting-edge training methods designed to build empathy and cultural awareness. Virtual reality simulations allowed students to experience healthcare scenarios from diverse patient perspectives, immersing them in situations they might not otherwise encounter. Interdisciplinary workshops brought together medical students with social workers, community health advocates, and patients from underserved communities, fostering dialogue and understanding across different backgrounds. The tension in the room was palpable as students wrestled with uncomfortable truths about themselves and the medical profession. One student raised her hand, her voice trembling slightly as she asked,
"How can we be sure we won't make the same mistakes? How do we guard against our own biases?"
Dr. Evans nodded, acknowledging the weight of her question.
It starts with awareness,
He replied.
but it doesn't end there. It's a lifelong commitment to questioning our assumptions and listening to our patients.
Dr. Evans then highlighted innovative approaches being implemented in medical schools across the country. Some institutions had introduced longitudinal cultural competency curricula that spanned all 4 years of medical education, ensuring that these skills were reinforced throughout a student's training. Others had developed mentorship programs pairing students with physicians from diverse backgrounds, providing role models and guidance in navigating complex cultural dynamics in healthcare settings. As the lecture drew to a close, Dr. Evans posed a final question to the students.
How will you use what you've learned today to shape the future of healthcare?
The room buzzed with energy as students began to share their ideas and commitments. Some pledged to advocate for policy changes in their future hospitals. Others discussed starting peer support groups to help each other recognize and address biases. One student proposed developing a smartphone app that would provide real-time cultural context and language support during patient interactions. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the somber mood at the beginning of the lecture. As the students filed out, many lingered to speak with Dr. Evans, their eyes alight with determination. It was clear that this wasn't just another lecture. It was the beginning of a transformation in medical education, one that promised to create a more empathetic, culturally aware generation of healthcare providers. Simone and Charles stood on the hospital rooftop, their hands intertwined as they gazed out over the sprawling city. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the sterile white walls they had left behind. Simone's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of pain and hope swirling within them.
We've come so far,
Charles murmured, his voice thick with emotion.
but there's still so much work to do.
Simone nodded, her grip on his hand tightening.
Every patient who walks through those doors is a chance to make a difference.
She said, her voice gaining strength.
We can't stop now.
As they turned to leave, the weight of their journey settled on their shoulders. The fight for equality in medicine was far from over, but they were ready to face it together, one patient at a time.